Hey guys, here with Lizard Wizard Reptiles. Today we're going to be doing a ball python care guide for beginners. So I'm going to teach you everything I do to take care of my ball pythons, and if you've been thinking about getting one, we're going to teach you everything you need to know. Okay, so for our ball python care guide, we're going to be talking about a few different categories. So we're going to be talking about the size of the animal and their behavior and what you can expect when you get your new pet. We're also going to be talking about enclosure setup. We're going to be talking about the heating and lighting for your ball python. We're going to be talking about diet and water, as well as humidity. Okay, so next thing we're going to talk about is size and behavior of your ball python. So this is an adult female. You can expect them to get about this big when they're full grown. Females can grow to about 5 to 6 feet when full grown, and males usually are around 4 to 5 feet, being a little bit smaller. With their behavior, I would say for the most part, most ball pythons are pretty tame and very handleable, just like the one you see right here. And this is our girl Candy, if y'all haven't seen her on our previous videos. But she's very calm, very handleable, good for kids to handle. But now I will say, all snakes are individuals, so you could have a snake that's a little bit more defensive, or maybe a snake that has come from a bad situation and he's just extra defensive. But as long as you can work with them and try and handle them regularly, they usually become pretty tame, just like she is. Okay, so the next topic we're going to talk about is enclosure. So as I said, you're going to need a pretty good size enclosure for this big of a snake. So there is a lot of misinformation out there about ball pythons, especially older information you get from books and things like that are going to say, oh, you can put the ball python in a 20-gallon enclosure, like a 40-gallon enclosure. While this might be good for a baby ball python, once they get to about this size, you're going to need a lot more. So the general rule of thumb for ball python enclosure size is whatever the length of the snake is, the width and length of your enclosure should be as long as the snake. So in this case, we have probably about a 6-foot python, so you're going to need a 4 by 2 by 2 foot enclosure when they're an adult. And we actually have some of those enclosures right here and set up for our adult ball pythons. As you can see, we put a lot of foliage and things like that in the enclosure, like these green vines. We have driftwood and cork bark hides in the background. So just lots of enrichment and things to make the animal feel secure. That's one of the most important things for ball pythons, is that they feel secure in their enclosure. Another thing that is kind of a misconception with ball pythons is a lot of people think that we can just keep them in small tubs, which can be done properly if you have the right size tubs, but people think they can keep them in just really small tubs because in the wild, ball pythons live in termite mounds. And in all actuality, ball pythons do spend a lot of time in the wild in termite mounds, but they do come out pretty frequently, especially at night, to hunt and to explore their environment. As far as the type of enclosure you're going to want to use, you can go with just about anything, but some enclosures are going to be better for keeping humidity than others. So what we use, there are PVC enclosures, and so PVC enclosures are going to be a lot better at holding in humidity. If you do want to go for something like a glass enclosure though, or an aquarium, or even like a tub, the aquariums especially are going to be a lot harder to keep humidity in, but you can put like foil over the top or some kind of plastic to cover it to help keep some of that humidity in. But you do still need to make sure that some of the enclosure is opened up so that the animal can still get well ventilated. Okay, also for your enclosure, we're going to talk about substrate. So there's a lot of different substrates you can use for ball pythons. A lot of substrates you can buy from reptile stores online, things that are made for reptiles, or just things you can get at the hardware store. So I have my own personal recommendation for soil. So what we use, and we've seen it hold humidity very well for them over time that we've used it, but we use cocoa chip for our enclosures, and we just put a layer of that down and it really holds humidity very well. But other alternative substrates you could use like a topsoil sphagnum moss mix that should hold humidity very well. It's also going to be a good bit cheaper because you can just get organic topsoil at your local hardware store, and you can get sphagnum moss there as well. But we've seen over our time that what works best to hold the humidity is going to be the cocoa chip. Okay, so now we're going to talk about heating and lighting for your ball python. So we're going to talk about heating first. There's a lot of different ways that you can heat your ball python. So you can either do this with a overhead heat lamp, you can do this with a ceramic heat emitter, or you can do it with heat tape or a heat pad underneath the enclosure. So I think honestly what works best of all of those options is going to be a heat mat underneath the enclosure, because when they're hiding, they're going to be spending a lot of time on the ground, and that's where they're mostly going to need their heat from, is under their belly. Now, the reason why they need heat in the first place is because reptiles, unlike us, are cold-blooded, so they need to thermoregulate their body temperature. So if they're getting too cold, they need to go to a warm side of the enclosure to warm their body temperature up. If they're a little bit too hot, then they can go to a cool side of the enclosure to cool down. But any of these heat sources that you might use, just keep in mind that you will need to use a thermostat, and we actually have one right here set up. So we have the thermostat set to, basically it's going to turn off the heat if it ever gets too hot in the enclosure, because we don't want it getting so hot that it's going to burn our animal or it's just going to overheat them. So you always want to make sure to have a thermostat. Now, to talk about the temperature range you want for your ball pythons, you're going to need to get a infrared heat gun to read the temperatures in your enclosure to get the most accurate readings. So the temperatures that you're going to want on your hot side of the enclosure, so where the heat tape is, you're going to want to be about 92 to maybe 94 degrees Fahrenheit. And then on the cool side of the enclosure, you're going to want it to be closer to 70, in between 70 and like 78 degrees Fahrenheit, so they have a place where they can go and cool down. So to further talk about lighting, we also need to talk about their day-night cycle. So these are nocturnal animals. They're mostly going to be awake at night, but they still need a day-night cycle to know when it's daytime and when it's nighttime. And if you're heating your enclosure with an under-tank heat mat or a ceramic heat emitter, there's going to be no light in your enclosure. Now, a lot of people will say ball pythons don't even need light, but it is really good to go ahead and give your animal a day-night cycle. So if you're using heat tape under your enclosure, you can do something similar to what we've done. We have LED light strips underneath the enclosures here, and that is just what we use to give them the day-night cycle. Now, with ball pythons, you don't need any kind of special lighting such as UVB that you would normally need for, say, species like bearded dragons or almost every other species of reptile. But snakes don't really need UVB. They get most of their calcium from the rodents and things that they eat. Okay, now we're going to talk about humidity. So humidity is very, very important for ball pythons. So where they come from in Africa, they have very, very humid days, and they spend their times, a lot of times, down in termite mounds that are even more humid. And what this does is it's going to keep them from getting respiratory issues, for one. It's also going to very much help with them shedding, because snakes shed their skin every so often as they're growing, and even when they're adults. So this humidity level is going to help them through that process, and it's very important to keep them healthy. So the humidity levels you're going to want in your enclosure for a ball python are going to be in between 60 and 80%. Now, with the humidity, it doesn't have to be perfectly that all the time, but you want it to stay somewhere in that range. If you're having trouble keeping humidity, usually what we do is we just mist down the enclosure every day with a big misting machine. A big sprayer. So we spray down the enclosure to spike the humidity up, and then we usually do that about a couple times a day, and that should hold the humidity right where we need it. Also, as I said earlier, with the glass enclosures, like covering up part of it can help hold in humidity. So if you have a big screen top, you can cover up part of the top, and that should help you hold humidity for a little bit longer, because you also don't want to be overspraying your enclosure, like, you know, say 4 or 5 times a day, because then this is going to make their environment always wet. And you don't want their environment to be wet, you want it to be humid. Their environment always being wet can lead to things like your substrate molding. It can lead to sicknesses in your animals, such as respiratory issues and things like that. So you want to make sure that you keep your humidity right between 60 and 80% to be safe. So for our last topic, we actually switched out to Teddy. Teddy is our banana pastel yellow belly pied ball python, and we're actually raising him up to be a future breeder here. But to go ahead and get into the last topic, we're going to be talking about diet for your ball python. So the diet for your ball python is actually pretty simple. They're going to be eating a diet of exclusively rodents. So now you're also going to need to know what size rodents to feed your ball python throughout its lifespan. So the easiest way that I do this is you want to take the size of your ball python and you want to get a rat or a mouse that's just a bit bigger than the thickest part of their body. And if you do that, you should be good throughout their entire life, as long as you're raising the size of the rodent as your animal grows. So right now, Teddy is feeding on weaned rats. Usually with some of my younger ball pythons, like the baby ball pythons, we start them out usually on large rats, depending on their size, large mice, depending on their size. So we'll start them out on large mice, and then pretty quickly they work their way up to weaned rats like this guy is on. And then at that point, you're feeding them rats for the rest of their lives pretty much. Now, when they're adults, you're not going to follow the rule anymore about it being just a little bit bigger around than their body. Once they're full grown, a medium rat or a small rat should be enough to feed your adult ball python. Now, about feeding schedules, he's being a little funny right now, but now for your feeding schedules, this is a little bit more complicated also, because when they're younger, you feed them a lot more often, and then as they get older, you kind of slow the frequency of how often you're feeding them. So, so when they're babies, you're going to want to feed them about once every 5 to 7 days. So that's what they're going to start out at. And now we have Teddy here. Teddy is already to the point where we're starting to feed him about every 10 days. And then once they get a little bit bigger, you're going to feed them every 12 days. And then once they're adults, you only feed them about once every 2 weeks, sometimes even 3 weeks. Another thing we need to talk about with the ball python diet is that ball pythons sometimes just go on eating strikes. Sometimes it can be a medical reason, sometimes it can be because they're stressed out, other times it's just because they just don't want to eat right now. Now, this isn't always a bad thing, because ball pythons can survive a good long time without a meal, but you want to keep an eye on their weight, because if they start losing weight, you know that there's something else going on and that they're just not hungry at the moment. But I've had ball pythons in the past go, 2, 3, 4 months without eating, and they didn't really drop, but maybe, like 10 grams here or there. So I wasn't really worried about it. And then eventually when they were ready, they started eating again. But it's kind of hard to know what reason they're not eating. Especially when you get a brand new ball python, sometimes they won't eat for a couple weeks or even a month because they're just trying to get settled into their new home and get used to their new environment. But if you stay vigilant and try to feed them as often as you can, if they refuse it and they're not losing weight, don't worry about it. They will eventually eat when they're ready. Okay, now the next thing we need to talk about with their diet is now whether or not you want to feed them live rodents or you want to feed them frozen thawed. So I'm going to give you a couple reasons for both. So we feed all of our snakes here frozen thawed rodents. We think it's just better for them in the long run. It's the safest option. So let me give you an example of a reason why you would need to use a live mouse. So some ball pythons just will not eat a frozen rat or mouse. Now, I've never specifically had this issue myself, but I've known other people who have, and they just won't eat anything other than a live mouse. So, so sometimes if it's a last resort, you may have to feed them a live mouse or rat, but we really recommend trying to get them on frozen thawed rats and mice. We got Rex going crazy over here. But we really recommend that you get them on frozen thawed rats and mice, because another thing that can happen when you're feeding live rodents, especially if your snake is uninterested in the rat and it doesn't strike at it immediately, is that rat could hurt your snake also. I've actually had this happen before with a snake I wasn't able to get to eat for a very long time, so I did try a live mouse. It still didn't work, and the mouse ended up biting my snake. And of course, I was there watching the whole time, and if I wasn't there watching the whole time, things could have gotten really bad. But that's why we recommend feeding frozen thawed. Okay, and the last thing I want to mention, and it's kind of along with diet, so they're also going to need a water bowl in their enclosure. So snakes obviously need water, and they're going to want to drink pretty frequently. So you want a clean water bowl in their enclosure at all times, so that way they can have a drink whenever they need it. But also, as we said before, to keep your humidity up, you're going to be misting down the enclosure often. And this is also very good to keep them hydrated, because they might lick the water driplets off like any leaves or foliage you have in the enclosure off the top of their hides. So misting and always making sure they have a clean water bowl should keep them well hydrated. Also, when you're putting a water dish in your enclosure, make sure you always add some reptile safe water conditioner. So this will take any chlorine out of the water and make it very safe for your reptile to drink. That was our ball python care guide for beginners. I hope y'all all enjoyed it. We're going to be doing lots more educational videos and care guides in the future, so please hit the subscribe button below so you don't miss any of our future videos.